She brings 35 years of experience in the field of problem and responsible gambling, including treatment, prevention, research, and responsible gambling to her positions. She has managed problem gambling programs within the VA, in the private sector, and within state systems. She's participated in research on brief screening for problem gambling, as well as a broad range of other problem gambling related research projects. She's provided consultation and training on gambling disorder throughout the U.S. and for the military and internationally and globally. She has worked as responsible gambling specialist with the North American Association of State and Provincial Lotteries. She is assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Maryland and special projects consultant with the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling. She is the 2019 recipient of the Dr. Robert Custer Lifetime Award for Direct Service awarded by the National Council on Problem Gambling. I was there to see that. And congratulations, even a couple of years after, Dr. Rugle. But we are so happy to have you. So I will let you take the floor now.
Great. Thanks so much, Robbie, and welcome everyone. And thanks for spending the next hour with us. And somebody chatted in that the message was that this was dealing with problem gambling. And even though it's not in the title, the focus of this is language around gambling disorder for those with the disorder and their concerned significant others. So hopefully that addresses some concerns. Um, and let me try to back up here. Yeah, yep, there we go. I have to tell you that my cat sat on my keyboard this morning. And I'm not sure what keys she sat on, but it's been doing some funny things. So hopefully we won't have too many glitches. But as background to what provoked me to come up with this presentation, I was sitting in a conference and the session was on addressing family concerns and concerns of loved ones, addressing the issue of problem gambling. And the presenters, really good counselors, but they kept presenting in terms of saying the gambler, and the gambler does this, and the gambler does that, and then the gambler. And I was getting really uncomfortable, really kind of tight inside and kind of a glitch every time they said the gambler. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine who's a person in recovery from a gambling disorder, and she leaned over to me and said, if they say the gambler once more, I'm going to scream and run out of the room. So I realized it was not just my own idiosyncratic discomfort with the way language was being used and how that was landing for some of us. And that kind of what provoked this presentation. So why words matter? Words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. And I have always loved dandelions. And even as a kid, I was confused about why people wanted to destroy the dandelions in their yard. And it's, well, because they're weeds. But I thought of them as flowers and thought they might be worth savoring and enjoying. So that quote really struck with me. And then another quote on words that actually has been attributed to about everybody, including Margaret Thatcher and Churchill and Gandhi and Buddha. Um, and I found that out because when I first quoted this, I attributed it to Gandhi, and a very considerate participant in the training corrected me and said, no, that's really from Lao Tzu. And of course, being a bit on the compulsive side, as soon as I got out of that training, went back and looked it up and found out that everybody has said this. So watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become actions. Watch your actions, for they become habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. And I'd even flip this a little bit. So watch your thoughts for they become words, but also watch your words because they become your thoughts. And I think our words influences our thoughts and become our implicit ways of viewing the world that we may not even understand and be aware of. And, that implicit way of perceiving the world that's kind of just below our level of awareness is so powerful because we don't always see what's happening and understand why we're perceiving the world in a way that may not be a clear reflection of reality. So here's a question, and feel free to chat in any response you may have to this. Why are self-help groups for those with addictive disorders and their concerned others anonymous? Grief support groups aren't anonymous. Other kinds of self-help groups may not be anonymous. You know, why are we concerned that nobody really know who we are? Safety, yeah. Shame, yeah. Stigma, absolutely. What really grabbed my attention, I was doing some work with some folks in Japan, and they told me, well, in Japan, it's such a shame-based culture that in their GA meetings, they make up names. They don't even use their real first names because the shame of being out of control with their gambling goes so deep. And gambling is such a part of East Asian cultures, that this is something everybody does and adults are expected to do, but not lose control. That loss of control is such a shameful part for individuals within that culture. So, yeah, it's reflected the shame and the stigma, and how people label themselves is part of that. Uh, Dandelion salad, yeah, yeah. The judgment that others, if anybody knows, I would be shunned and stigmatized. So we have to keep this secret because of the shamefulness. Yeah. And this was another trigger for this presentation. At about the same time I was putting this together, this appeared in a news feed. The Gambling Nuns of Torrance, California, and just let this picture and these images of how these nuns are being portrayed sink in. And just before you start filtering, and telling yourself, oh no, that's not, just be aware of the initial feelings that arose at that picture. Maybe some disgust. Nuns aren't supposed to be wearing sunglasses like that. Nuns aren't supposed to be drinking and gambling and going to Vegas and living the high life. That's disgusting. What hypocrisy. And that's exactly the tone of the article. Here's some phrases. Thou shalt not steal unless you're one of the Vegas loving nuns who allegedly took the Catholic school under their watch for every penny they could. A Southern California community reckons with an altogether new form of churchly hypocrisy. And I kept reading this article and reading this article to see if they might mention that maybe these nuns had a disorder. Maybe they had an illness rather than being immoral and engaging in, and never once, not even close, not even a suggestion of the possibility, but so many things jumped out at me, and one of them was as soon as it was caught that they had been taking the money from the school under their charge, they confessed. They said yes, and there was a lot of there was no attempt to hide it, no denial. They knew they had done wrong. And that's not typical for somebody who might be an antisocial personality disorder like they're being portrayed. Um, but the language of it was just so stigmatizing, so biased, so lacking in any thought of compassion. And that's understandable. People don't recognize this disorder. But we'll look at some other research that says that it's more than just not recognizing the disorder. Yeah, I did call the California consul and try to find out, is anybody helping these nuns? Is anybody doing an assessment to see if, they actually do have a gambling disorder, as I suspected? Um, and, I gather someone had reached out and hopefully they were getting some help. Mm. Yeah. And certainly this has applied to addiction more generally. And I'm not going to play this because even though I can share the volume, it's really low. But basically, what Michael Botticelli, who had been, a chief federal drug addiction specialist, these are issues and these are words that have a dramatic impact on both clinical care and about how medical professionals actually see and treat people with addiction, whether we use the word junkie or addict or druggie or degenerate or pathological gambler. The words have an impact not just on how I feel about you, but that then translates into actions that impact public health approaches to these disorders. Um, a different perspective than the ones in the article about the nuns um, is a more compassionate approach. And I like these guidelines that I took from a book. It's called The Book on Forgiving. It's written by Desmond Tutu and his daughter, based on their experience in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. No one is bad. No person should be defined as the sum total of their worst actions. And think about that. When we label somebody as you're a pathological gambler, you're a pathological compulsive gambler, we're saying that's who you are. That is the sum total of your identity, nothing else. And that's not, that's identifying that person by the sum total of their worst actions, their worst behaviors. None of us is an offender, liar, betrayer, or monster. We are all fragile and flawed humans who may lie or steal or betray or even behave monstrously. When we do these things, we are not monsters. We are human beings who have become separated from our own goodness. And there are causes and conditions that have led to that separation. And there is a need for healing to repair that separation, to reconnect with our own human goodness, not necessarily a punishment, a judgment. Um, yeah, a stigmatization, an othering that can go on. So think about this. We've all been labeled in some ways throughout our lives, maybe in childhood, maybe as adults. So, how have you been labeled? And how do you label yourself? We don't even often let that maybe seep up into conscious. How do we label ourselves, even if it's in the own inner resources of our heart? And feel again free to chat in how you've been labeled and whether that helped you feel positively toward yourself or not so good about yourself. And how do you label yourself? Do you label yourself in compassionate ways or maybe harsh and critical ways? And how does that land? How does that land? Chat in any label, any words. Yeah, let's see what we've got here. Fat, bully, as feeling judged and labeled. Yeah, not pleasant, not pleasant. Old, smarty pants. When I was a kid, I was called the brain, and I was ambivalent about that. In part, I was proud of it because people were seeing that maybe I was smart, but then it made me feel excluded, that I was somehow different from the other kids and not as approachable or likable in some ways. Yeah, so, yeah. Well, poor. Yeah. Yeah, labels can have mixed connotations and reactions, and it can depend on where the label is coming from. If it's from me, then I'm empowered by that. I'm taking control of my identity. If it's coming from somebody else, not so much. So there can be all sorts of variations on that. And again, I thought about that in terms of myself. And let's see, one more. Yeah, listening to others um, can be helpful and not so helpful, can be harmful and reassuring, depending on, the nature, the quality, the content of what's being said. So, yeah, I've come to, as you can see, think of myself and label myself as a little old gray haired lady. I realized that when in the days when, I was taking Uber lifts places when traveling was more possible. And, I described myself for the Uber driver. I put in little old gray haired lady. And so, in thinking about this, I said, well, I wonder what that conveys. And so I Googled that. And what came up was, a lot of Maxine cartoons. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that's the way I want to be perceived, and a lot of pictures like the one with the older woman walking with the cane, not being quite stable and steady and, you know, being somewhat disabled and, hunched over. And well, that's not really me. I don't want to be perceived in that way. So I thought, well, what would be another way of thinking of myself? So I Googled petite, silver haired older woman. These were not the first images that came up, I must say. The first image stuff that came up were all these porn sites. And I thought, oh my God, how do I get rid of these? I don't want these stuck in my computer. And after I got over that panic, I thought, well, who knew? Who knew that was a thing? I certainly didn't, you know. And I thought, well, gee, maybe there's more to this older woman than I thought. But other than that, I finally came up with some of these images, which were kind of much more in line with the way I'd like to be perceived. So, still working on that self labeling thing. Um, and kind of moving over to kind of where I was coming from in listening to that presentation that made me so uncomfortable. When you've heard presentations on the topic of gambling disorder, What words have you heard or seen clinicians or researchers or advocates or presenters or those in recovery use to describe themselves or their clients or their subjects? Uh, let's see what we got here. Addicts, those people. Yeah. Problem gamblers, gamblers, addict, junkie, derelict. Yeah. And it's by people who care a lot about the folks they're working with who have this disorder. It's not that they don't care, but that's what we call people who have addictive disorders. It's just what's always been done. It's the words you use. It's a good shorthand. Um, and along with those words, um, I can't tell you how many presentations I've sat through where somebody, a presenter, might be a person in recovery or a psychologist or an addiction specialist, talk about characteristics of a person who has a gambling disorder: liar, manipulator, con person, irresponsible, immature, you know and wow, I'm thinking, this is feeling increasingly uncomfortable to label so globally somebody who's struggling with a gambling disorder, as if this were the sum total of who they are as a person, not just things they do as a result of having a gambling disorder. Very, very different ways of thinking. If I'm talking about somebody to an audience who has little, or no minimal experience with somebody who has a gambling disorder, I'm saying, well, they're liars and manipulators and con people, and they're. Would I want to start working with that population? I'd run for the hills. Why would I want to do that? Um, and in part, this is what's contributed to folks who aren't experienced in working with folks with gambling disorder or other addicted populations, seeing that in a chart, if it's a primary care clinic, and all the defenses go up. The armor comes up. Oh my, got to watch out. They're probably going to be drug seeking and they're not going to want to pay their bills, and we're going to have trouble with this one. And imagine what that sets the stage for in care settings. Yeah. Um, so in this one piece of research, they gave participants a scenario, and it was this: Dan is a man who lives in your community. During the last 12 months, he started to gamble more than his usual amount of money. He's even noticed that he needs to gamble much more than he used to in order to get the same feeling of excitement. Several times he's tried to cut down or stop gambling, but he can't. Each time he's tried, he became agitated and couldn't sleep, so he gambled again. He's often preoccupied by thoughts of gambling and gambles more to recover his losses. He's also lied to his family and friends about the extent of his gambling. Now, for those of you familiar with DSM-5 criteria for problem gambling, this covers the gamut. This is simply a description of all the criteria to meet a gambling disorder, expressed pretty objectively. Um, and so they asked people, to pick which characteristics they would attribute to Dan. And here's what people came up with: impulsive, irresponsible, irrational, foolish, untrustworthy, unproductive, greedy, and antisocial. Now, when we go back, if I can, oh, shoot, I did it again. go back to this description, it doesn't say any of that in there. It doesn't say he's immature and irresponsible. It doesn't say he's impulsive. It doesn't say he's irrational or foolish or untrustworthy or even unproductive and greedy. Certainly not antisocial, you know. But these are what people attribute to somebody who's just given the characteristics of somebody who meets criteria for a gambling disorder. And that bias immediately comes in just by that description. Another study found that both terms, problem gambler and gambling addict, had the same negative stereotypes. But even the term gambler had the same associations, only somewhat less negatively than the terms problem gambler and gambling addict. So just gambler. People could say, well, that's a neutral term. I can certainly use that when I'm presenting. And I had a wonderful psychologist when I was spouting off on this importance of language say, well, gee, that, the language you suggest is much more awkward. Can't I just say that, that this is what I mean at the beginning of the presentation? And what I'm going to use for shorthand is gambler throughout the presentation. And I said, no, not good enough. Because what people will hear is the word gambler or problem gambler, and that will continue reinforcing any negative stereotypes they might hold. So we really have to pay attention to the language. And much of this work has been done with other addictive disorders, particularly substance use disorders. And the National Council on Problem Gambling has a really nice little one pager on this as well. So, person who uses substances rather than substance abuser, recurrence of use rather than relapse, pharmacotherapy rather than medication assisted, accidental drug poisoning rather than overdose. A much more accurate description of what's happened. Person with a substance use disorder rather than addict, druggie, junkie, alcoholic, opioid addict. Language matters. And it's referred to as person first language because we're acknowledging, first of all, that we're talking about a person, a human being who's experiencing some problem, not somebody, as we mentioned earlier, who's totally, um, whose whole identity is the problem. So we're talking about people who have problems, not people who are problems. Um, and rather than clean, a person in recovery or a person who's meeting their recovery goals. It's so common, especially in substance use, to talk about dirty or dirty urines or clean, rather than if a person is showing that they've maintained their abstinence, or certainly in terms of harm reduction, meeting recovery goals if their goals don't happen to be abstinence. Let me check in on some comments here. Oh, bless you, the whole nation needs to hear this. I agree. That's why I keep spouting off about it. A client stated his daughter died from an overdose, which was a negative way of stating what happened. Yeah. Yeah, and we don't think about our ordinary everyday language unless we really put the effort into thinking, how is that going to land? You know, what does that encourage me to think about this person? Or if for me, it's always paying attention to my embodied experience when I hear certain words and really being attuned to that and then being curious about why that is. That's kind of how I've learned um, what might be helpful or not so helpful. Um, so the power of labelings is what in certainly in mindfulness circles we think of as othering. You know, well, I'm a human being, but that person is something else, other, and so they can be shunned, outcast, excluded, not as deserving, not part of a common humanity. And certainly, with our discussions around white privilege and racism that have been really tough and difficult ones coming out of the murders of Black and brown bodies in our country most recently. Um, this is so powerful that we recognize that we really don't see some people as part of the common humanity that I'm a part of. If I'm not a person with an addiction, then for me, my normal is defined as being not addicted. And so I'm coming at that from kind of a privileged, not addicted framework. And I don't see that my bias is from that limited frame that I see the world. And the same with whiteness. We don't see whiteness because we assume that that's normal. Yeah, and that's not true. Not true. So in doing therapy and in talking about these difficult issues of addiction and recovery, realizing what framework am I seeing this from? And in what ways am I othering people who may be different from me? And not understanding our commonness, appreciating our differences because they're important, but they're not the truth of humanity. And hopefully that makes sense. And changing language, is not just a polite thing to do. When I told one of my colleagues about this presentation, he thoughtfully sent me the old George Carlin routine on the 7 words that you can't say on television that spoke to the political correctness of language. And, I called him back and said, I think I'm a little offended at that. This is more important than just being politically correct. Terminology that can imply that problem gambling is the result of a personal defect or lack of morality. And research has shown that people rate problem gambling as more likely caused by bad character. So we really have to combat this in the language we use. Research shows that people with a gambling disorder are viewed negatively as perilous, non recoverable, disruptive, dangerous. And when we go back to that snippet on Dan, most of the respondents said they didn't want to socialize with Dan. If he were at a party they were at, they wouldn't want to talk to him. They wouldn't want to live next door to Dan. They wouldn't want their daughters going out with Dan or marrying Dan. That's shunning. That has implications. If I'm a medical provider, I don't want to pick Dan as my patient. So real world implications. If I'm an insurance company, I don't want to reimburse for the problems that Dan is having. We don't want to include Dan in the Americans for Disabilities Act, which is true of gambling disorders. So these stereotypes and stigmas have very concrete, tangible implications. I came across this study just this past week, Lessons from Opioid Use Disorder Research. No one single term can reduce all potential stigma biases. For example, when they used medical terminology like this is a brain disease, this is a chronically relapsing brain disease, the ratings reduced the ratings of somebody having personal blame. So that was positive. This isn't just due to bad character, but it decreased the ratings that people could recover, that this person could recover. They were rated less recoverable. And it increased perceptions of dangerousness, that the person should be socially excluded. Oh, there's something wrong with that person's brain. They must be dangerous. So it just using more medical terminology didn't decrease all of the ways people were stigmatized. If non-medical terminology were used, this is an individual having an opioid problem, it increased the perception that the person was to blame for the problem, but simultaneously rated that recovery was more likely and the person wasn't as dangerous and didn't need to be socially excluded. So, it may not be as simple as anything ever as we first think. And just constantly being aware of how our words are landing with the people that we're talking to, and perhaps using mixed languages and using both languages to help people have a more complete perception. Yeah, run into reimbursement issues with insurance companies who still use DSM-4. Yeah, 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 yeah. No quick fixes for life. Absolutely. And I was just talking to a group about gaming disorder, yeah, video gaming disorder that still isn't in the DSM, and the fact that, nobody is reimbursing for that. And well, what happens when it's finally in DSM-6 several years down the line? Well, like you just mentioned, even after it's in the DSM, it's still going to be a battle. We still have to advocate. There will still be obstacles to overcome. So, recommendations is that we really think about language that emphasizes hope and the potential for recovery, and language that respects individual autonomy and choice, self efficacy, and multiple pathways for recovery. Um, and that might be particularly in terms of using abstinence based language and all or nothing language versus recognizing the choice that individuals have on their journey into well being and recovery. And language and stories that humanize individuals who have a gambling disorder and their family members, avoiding fear and blame that portray those who are suffering as other. And in the field, we've often wanted to get people's attention about how serious this disorder is. Take us seriously. It's not just inconvenient behavior. And in doing so, we've used our most sensational stories of the worst things that our clients have done. There was one woman who was the spouse of somebody with a gambling disorder who presented at a national conference and had a horrible, gut wrenching story of how she was almost murdered by her husband, and ended up and I was again, I was cringing and saying, is this the story that we want to represent? What the majority of folks with a gambling disorder are about? Or are those extremes just stories that are going to make anybody suffering from this disorder seem other than somebody who's part of a common humanity? So, I think that emphasizing hope and recovery in the way we portray and use our language is so absolutely critical. And for a moment, just also thinking about family members, concerned significant others, and what they hear when they reach out. And, I certainly earlier in my career have done this to poor family members Um, so, and maybe presenting this is my way of making amends to those that I may have harmed by my misuse of language. So they hear, you're doing too much, you're an enabler, you're codependent. You need to kick them out. You need to give tough love. Let them hit bottom, set boundaries, detach. And the basic message is you're wrong. You're really screwing up. You're doing this all wrong. You're really, more graphically, to use an F bomb, you're effing it up. I mean, and that's what they've been telling themselves anyway. And so the language we may use is just reinforcing that, you know, I'm unworthy, you know, my behavior is shameful. Nobody understands what I'm going through. Yeah, is what they shout out. Yeah, and that's not helpful. I wondered why the family members didn't come back for a second session. You know? Duh. You know, if I thought about it, um, you know, we certainly want to help family members look at their behavior, but in somewhat less harsh, more compassionate, less judgmental ways. And we can do that. Um, so again, person first language, codependent, you know, and when I supervise folks and they talk about families and I say, oh, well, that spouse is really codependent, as if that is the whole answer to working with this person. You know, that it stops. That's where oh, and on the other, or they're in denial, family members or individuals with a gambling disorder, as if that answers the whole question, rather than this is a person who has a loved one with an addiction. Enabling. They're using unhelpful ways to respond to addictive behavior, or they're using behaviors that may reinforce excessive gambling. Tough love. And I've noticed that the emphasis is always on the tough. Okay, you may be loving, but that may be part of the problem. You're too loving. You got to get tougher, which means armoring up. At least it did to me, rather than courageous, firm compassion. You know, and we identify compassion with the soft side of compassion, the tenderness, the gentleness, the caring. And there's another side to compassion that's strong and firm and says, no, 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 my love, you can't have all the cookies before dinner. We have to save those for dessert after you've had some protein and some vegetables and some vitamins. That's firm compassion. My one cat, the one who sat on my keyboard, um, loves to try to get at the leftover milk from my cereal in the morning. And every time she does that, she throws up. So in the morning, I have to be firmly compassionate. Oh, my dear Sari cat, I know you love this milk, but it's not good for you. You throw up and it hurts. It hurts me not to give her that milk. I feel like such a Grinch, but it's not good for her. That's firm, strong, courageous, honest compassion, and allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their behavior, even though it hurts your heart to watch that and be present for that. And that's where I have to be compassionate with myself. Detachment to me always seems to have some disconnecting character to it, rather than I need to practice balance, equanimity, and self compassion. So, first, compassion for me, and then I have the compassion to give to you. And I can balance those. It's not a shutting you out, it's not a disconnecting from you, but making sure I treat us equally with compassion. Um, and this is from a book by Wilkins and Foote, Beyond Addiction. What we don't talk enough about is, whoop, I can't see that word. Get this out of the way. Is the reality that it is normal to try and be helpful when someone you love is hurting themselves. That's normal. That's being human. It's normal to want to protect people we love from consequences of their behavior, especially when the outcome might be public humiliation, shame, incarceration, death, loss of job, loss of status, all the things that can go on with people finding out that a loved one has a gambling disorder. Right? And so it's normal to want to protect them, and it takes a lot of strength to allow those natural consequences. And they say, I'll walk here with you, I'll stay on the path with you as you experience these consequences. It's not going to be helpful to rescue you from them. So, so difficult. And it's our job as clinicians to help the families through that process and to not judge them if they say, I can't do that. It's too painful. I've got to bail them out. And then we work with that. We work with that. Was that helpful? Is what you've been doing working? If not, let's try something else. And language in the field of responsible gambling. This is the common phraseology in talking about the gambling industry, and what they can do to help reduce the harms of gambling activities. But in one study where they did focus groups, especially those who were associated with having a gambling problem in their lives or their families, they found the term responsible gambling stigmatizing because it implied irresponsible gambling. And it put the onus on the individual in terms of reducing the harm of gambling rather than looking at more industry based interventions. But the question is then, what do we use in place? Recreational and social gambling, or low risk gambling, safe gambling, healthy gambling? Um, so how do we refer to gambling that isn't creating any harms? Which is hard to do because another study found that almost half of recreational gamblers who did not report any symptoms of gambling problems were responsible for 50% of the harms experienced by individuals' gambling activities. So, recreational gambling doesn't assume that no harms are being experienced. Like, I gambled so much that I don't have enough money to spend on any coffee from Starbucks this week, to I can't pay my bills. So, a whole range of harms may be experienced by those who don't meet any criteria of a problem gambling. And again, the policy implications of this language that talks about responsible gambling and the focus that puts on the individual, and the interventions by the gambling industry then become, oh, I just have to give people information on the odds of gambling and they'll make rational decisions. It presumes a rational decision maker, somebody who's not in the throes of a gambling disorder that may hijack their brains. I just need to give them information on how the games work. We just need to give them information on treatment resources and they will take advantage of those, or prevention messages or guidelines for how to keep gambling safe, or personalized feedback about how much time they've spent or how much money they spent, and they'll be able to make good use of that information, or voluntary self-exclusion, all putting the onus on the individual who's gambling needs to make choices about whether their gambling behavior is helpful or harmful. And we just have to provide information rather than looking at how can we make our products more responsible with mandatory limit setting. Um, the speed of the games, the faster the games are, the more money somebody will lose. The percentage of losses disguised as wins or near misses, and those losses disguised as wins are like on the multiple line slot machines where you have 5 lines and 5 columns, and you can get a quote win in any number of different ways, an X, a V, a zigzag line. But on some of those, or the majority of those, you're not winning back as much money as you put in. So it feels like a win. You get the bells and whistles, but you're not winning back as much. So you're constantly losing a little bit, but your brain is lighting up as if you were actually winning more money than you put in. So, and of course, people play machines with near misses and losses disguised as wins longer and more than machines who don't have those features. There's a stop button on many electronic gambling machines that does absolutely nothing significant, because as soon as you press the start button, the outcome of that spin, quote spin, is predetermined. As soon as you hit the start button, anything else you do has no meaning. All the stop button does is decrease the amount of time that you're getting that illusory spinning of the wheels on the machine that means absolutely nothing. Um, but it gives the illusion that I have control over the outcome. I can stop it just when it's going to win. And no, it doesn't work that way. Hours of operation, we don't have to operate 24/7. And availability, how many outlets are we going to have? Are we going to expand into online versions and things like that? So language has implications. And let me check a lot of activity in the chat. Illusions win. Yeah, our brains get fooled. They're not always as helpful as we think they are. Um, yeah, give yourself compassion, absolutely. And treatment approach, how is a man with a gambling problem different from one with drug or alcohol problems? That's a whole nother presentation on the similarities and differences with substance use and gambling disorder. Mostly similarities, but some significant differences that I think we need to appreciate to really connect with those with a gambling disorder. Um, and that'll be a cliffhanger, and maybe we'll do that presentation sometime. Um, and certainly one very significant difference that I'll give you is that gambling may be one of the few addictions where continued participation in the addictive behavior contains the possibility that that behavior might solve many of the problems created by the addiction, especially the financial ones. The next ticket might be the big one. Solve all my financial problems. So there's a seduction and a kernel of reality. If I'm drinking, I just forget about my problems for a while. It doesn't really solve them. But I could with that next spin of the wheel. So a significant difference. Um, Maybe the way we ask the criteria question is not the best way. In addiction, we are not present to make, yeah. If I have an addictive disorders, I'm not a rational decision maker. So those interventions may not be most helpful for me. Those assumptions that people can choose at any moment in time to gamble responsibly or not. Yeah. Find new ways to light up the brain to experience more. Yeah. 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 You know, um, and there are studies now that those near misses tend to light up the brain in the same way as a win. So our brains are happy, happy. This is good. This feels good. I'm having a good time. Keep going. It's no wonder that the near misses or almost ones keep a person at that machine or at that activity longer. Yeah, and there are things that can be done with the industry to decrease those illusions, decrease the impact, have fewer near misses or almost ones. And, it works. So we can do things both way. And the industry certainly has done a lot. And it's our job to say, good work. We're really happy with that. And you can do more. Let me check the questions. Frequent flyers. Yeah, yeah. Oh, another frequent flyer. Here's so and so again. Chronic relapser. Uh, okay. So let's see. So we're almost done here, but you may think about anything that was validated for you and really savor that. It feels so good to be validated, and I'm so happy to validate what people think and feel and are aware of. But also think about anything you may have learned or that created, hit you with any glitches. And I apologize if any of my language caused pain, but be curious about that pain or where you may be challenged and what that means for you. And finally, think about what you might implement or do or say differently moving forward. Let's see, one more comment here, a couple more. Thank you, thank you. Oh, you guys are most welcome. But some resources to be aware of, and the slides will be available, I'm sure. And my favorite saying, anyone can slay a dragon, he told me, but try waking up every morning and loving the world all over again. That's what takes a real hero. And you guys are all heroes. So thank you so very, very much.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rugle. That was really great. And yes, the slides will be available and the recording will be available on the UNC Behavioral Health Springboard website. This is good stuff. And what I've had to learn, what I have to continually learn is as a presenter myself, is I have to remain coachable because I'll hear in true transparency in some evaluations, I have to be mindful, speaking on a platform on labels that I might not have even known, and you talked about a few of them. So thank you for sharing that. And I think just remaining coachable and looking at it from through that lens. So thank you very much again. And everybody join us on February 16th, where Dr. Rugle will speak again on self-care, self-compassion in uncertain times. And next week, February 11th, with Dr. David Ledgerwood talking on gambling and co-occurring conditions. I think you got to most, if not all, the questions. So great job and great presentation.
Thank you all very much. Have a
Oh,
great couple of weeks.
yes.
Hopefully, be online with you again.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rugle. Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.
Have a
Bye
great rest of
bye.
your week. Bye bye.